Howdy my totally tubular gamers, and we are back for another ranking video, and today's ranking video is gonna be a fun one. Today we're doing the Marvel vs Capcom series. Well, not necessarily an anime game series, it's close enough, Anyway, the Marvel vs Capcom series of games is a series of fighting games, all developed by Capcom, and sees Capcom's greatest characters going against Marvel's ultimate heroes and villains. Marvel vs. Capcom has gone on to be one of the most beloved fighting game series in all of fighting games, and it's still played very regularly to this day in tournaments, as it is still just as popular these days as it was even 10 years ago. These games are known for its very fast gameplay, its really in-depth mechanics and combos, and maybe infinites, its amazing visuals, and its just huge cast of characters. Like, that is one thing that these games are known for, is their amazing cast of characters. The series had humble enough beginnings, originally coming out in the late 90s, and it was when Capcom was really on a roll with their fighting games. Now, in the mid-90s, Capcom actually developed two Marvel-based fighting games, being XMen Children of Atom and Marvel Superheroes. And since Capcom was already developing games with the Marvel license, someone smart at Capcom said, hey, what if we cross over Street Fighter with these Marvel characters? And so we actually got X-Men vs Street Fighter, then we got Marvel Superheroes vs Street Fighter, and then finally we got Marvel vs Capcom. The biggest gameplay aspect of the Marvel vs Capcom series is the tag mechanics, where instead of being a traditional one-on-one fighter, it's all about using your entire team. You can have either 2 or 3 different characters that you play one at a time to fight battles. You can switch these characters in and out at any time, and even use them for assists and other attacks. The amount of depth and skill that comes with these fighting games is just ridiculous, and there are so many pro players over the years that have done some crazy stuff in the Marvel vs. Capcom series. And the biggest disclaimer I want to give is, I am by no means a pro or a fighting game expert when it comes to these games, or any fighting game really. I've been a very casual player of the Marvel vs. Capcom series for well over a decade. I have played all the games quite a bit, and I enjoy almost all the games, and I'm just coming at this with a very casual view as a fan. I am not gonna sit here and tell you all the technicals, all the infinites, all the frame data. I'm not about that. This is just kind of a chill atmosphere where I'm just gonna rank my favorite Marvel vs. Capcom games based on my experiences. I'm not gonna tell you who the best characters are, which games are broken or busted, or any of that stuff. If you're looking for any of that, you're definitely in the wrong place. We're going to be ranking these games based on how much fun I had, the character roster, how I feel about the gameplay, how well it holds up nowadays, that kind of stuff. And with the series as beloved as Marvel vs. Capcom, I'm sure there's going to be disagreements in the comments. You should let me know though. Or maybe you want to tell me what your favorite is in a pro sense, in a casual sense, some good memories you had, or you just think I'm a complete idiot, which may be the case. But either way, you should let me know in the comments. And you should, of course, share and sub and all that great stuff. Anyway, what do I think is the worst Marvel vs. Capcom game? Well, actually, to be honest, I think the worst of the Marvel vs. Capcom series is sadly the newest game, Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite, released in 2017. This game really feels like a cheap cash-in on the Marvel vs. Capcom brand, and really the MCU brand as a whole, rather than being a true revival of the Marvel vs. Capcom series. And it really shows, as I think that this is the worst Marvel vs. Capcom game in pretty much every aspect. Like, the first thing I will say is that the game does have a story mode. The only Marvel vs. Capcom game to have a story mode, where it's all about Ultron teaming up with Sigma from Mega Man X, and they become Ultron Sigma, which is a pretty cool thing, and I gotta admit, the story mode is actually pretty cool in this game. There's some good fan service. However, a 3 to 4 hour story mode is not going to save this game. The biggest offender to the game is the character roster. The character roster is just absolutely gutted from the last couple MVC games. Like, on the Marvel side and the Capcom side. The Marvel side, they only wanted to use the Disney Marvel at the time. And so there's no X-Men, there's no Deadpool, there's no Fantastic Four, there's no Doctor Doom, and it's just completely gutted on that side. Then the Capcom side is just a joke. There are just some really questionable characters that they chose to have in this game, and a lot of the fan favorites are just not here, or even some of the good ones from MVC3, like Beautiful Joe and Amaterasu from Okami. Due to this smaller character roster, the game is not actually a 3v3 when it comes to the tag mechanics. It's 2v2 like the original Marvel vs. Capcom. But that was the original. This is the latest, where we have more popular Marvel and Capcom characters than ever before, and you're really cutting the roster down by this much. The graphics are very well documented on being just terrible. Like, they're just terrible in every aspect. The character models are just atrocious in particular, and yeah, no, it's not good. The game tries to be overly accessible, and this game actually brings back the Infinity Stones from the Marvel Superheroes fighting game, where each one stores a unique ability, and these are honestly, well, they're just really not needed in a game like this, and there's a reason they hadn't come back for so long, because they don't belong in a fighting game like this. Like most Capcom fighting games, there's really a lack of content, and it focuses more on the online. However, Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite was pretty much dead on arrival. Like, I got the game day one, and there was less than a couple hundred people playing on PC. There's definitely nobody playing now, and I have never seen this game played competitively. I saw people immediately go back to the old games that are much more beloved, and when I went to EVO, there's nobody playing this game. Trust me, there's nobody really playing this game. Sure, this game wasn't like totally awful, but compared to the other ones, yeah, it's pretty bad, and I wouldn't recommend it to anybody. The next game on our list is a good game, and it's the first of the Marvel vs. Capcom series. Well, not formally, but it is the first in the franchise, XMen vs. Street Fighter. XMen vs. Street Fighter is a very fun little fighting game that came out in the late 90s that really was great for the time, but it doesn't really offer all that much nowadays. It certainly doesn't stand head-to-head with some of the other games in the franchise, but it is by no means a bad game. It is a decent little fighting game that incorporates many gameplay elements from those other two Marvel fighting games, and just kind of Capcom 90s fighting games in general. It features 2-on-2 battles where you can switch between you and your partner at any time, and the person in the reserve recovers health over time. You can do some pretty cool combos, you build up a hyper gauge, use some super moves. It's pretty standard stuff here for, again, a 90s Capcom fighter. The character roster and the graphics, I will say, were not all that great, even for the time. The characters, in particular, were not amazing in this game. There's 16, 8 on each side, and nobody here is like a crazy or wild choice. It's pretty standard stuff. And the graphics were also very standard for the time. This game, it is a fun little fighting game, and if you want to take a trip down memory lane, it can do that, but when compared to the rest of the series minus Infinite, I don't think it holds a candle in the slightest, and there's a reason it's really forgotten amongst fighting game fans nowadays. The next game on our list is Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter, and I really don't have much to say about this game. Everything I just said about the previous game really carries over here. It's a very standard, just almost generic 90s Capcom fighter. It plays pretty much identical to XMen vs. Street Fighter, with almost the same characters even. Instead of it being exclusively XMen, they have a couple Marvel characters instead, but it's still only 16 characters, 8 on each side, 2v2 in battle, and it's some pretty fun, action-packed fighting. This was the MVC game to actually introduce the variable assist, which is where you can summon your tag team partner to do a special move or a little combo, which does add a bit of depth to the game. And it's the reason it's higher on this list. That, and I just kind of prefer Marvel as a whole than X-Men. That feels a little limited. But while this game is a fun little time, it doesn't really offer much in the modern day, and just like X-Men vs. Street Fighter, it's a good little novelty, maybe a trip down memory lane, but it's nothing more than that. The next game on our list is the first proper Marvel vs. Capcom game, and that is the original Marvel vs. Capcom Clash of the Superheroes. The original MVC actually plays almost identical to Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter, only with a few key differences. There are some new combos for characters, there's more combos, the game plays a bit faster, and the game actually got rid of the variable assist from the previous game. Instead, this game uses this guest summoning system. After you choose your two characters, because it is still 2-on-2, you get to choose a guest, and that will be the character you summon for a little assist here and there. These are actually characters that you don't get to play as, and there's 20 of these guys, and most of these characters would actually go on to just be regular characters in the series, but it's interesting to see where their start came from. This was actually the MVC game to introduce the duo team attack, where both of your characters use their super moves, which always awesome. This assist mechanic with the guests is fine enough, but it's not exactly my cup of tea, and I'd rather have more characters. Speaking of characters, the game only has 15 characters, which is really odd, and it's a pretty small roster. I will say the roster they do have is actually pretty good, considering how small it is. It's not flooded with X-Men and Street Fighter characters, which is good. It has a nice healthy mix, especially for the time when it came to Capcom. The game had a couple different modes on its home console release, which was cool, and the game was actually re-released on PSN and Xbox Live Arcade as Marvel vs. Capcom Origins. However, this was quickly taken off stores when the deal with Marvel and Capcom expired. Unfortunately, the game did have online play, so that was something. However, I will say that this game isn't exactly the most balanced. It's become pretty notorious for being very unbalanced with a few characters in particular. And when it comes to depth, there's really just not all that much here, and I think that there's not really much more here than the last two games. This is a fine little fighting game, but similar to the last two games, there's really not all that much reason to come back to it, especially when the later games exist. But it was good for the time. Now I think the second best Marvel vs. Capcom game is Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3. This game was obviously an expansion re-release of the original Marvel vs. Capcom 3 and is definitely the definitive way to play the game. I remember when the original Marvel vs. Capcom 3 came out and it was huge. It was one of the biggest releases ever at the time with tons of hype, promotional material, like it was huge, and I think Marvel vs. Capcom 3 was an excellent fighting game. I think it was very good. And then, of course, knowing Capcom, they re-released it as Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3, and this is the best version to play with more characters, more balancing, all that good stuff. Marvel vs. Capcom 3 really was Marvel vs. Capcom 2 on like steroids, as it plays pretty much the same as the second game with 3v3, very fast gameplay, lots of combos, crazy combos, juggling, being in the air hella long, all these hyper moves, using all the hyper moves at once. The game moved down to 3 attack buttons instead of 4 like normal as a way to make it so new players could come into it, and I thought this was a pretty good way to get new players into it. It wasn't making it casual or adding auto combos or some crap, it was just making it down to 3 buttons. The game introduced X Factor, which is basically this move that you can use at any point in the match where you will start regenerating health, do more damage, be faster, have extended combos, etc. And the worse off you are in the match, the better the X Factor will be, but you can only use it once a match. The game had a number of different modes in it, and the game had a pretty healthy online scene. In fact, I would still say the online scene is still ongoing. It's not exactly really alive all that much nowadays, but it's not dead. It's definitely not dead. The character roster in the game is just absolutely amazing. Like, it is just superb. It is the premier modern Marvel vs. Capcom roster. Ultimate features 52, yes, 52 characters in this game. That is insane. And while a few characters were kind of questionable, like why Mega Man wasn't there or why MODOK was there, there are just so many good characters here that I just love. So many amazing additions. Deadpool, Rocket Raccoon, Frank West, Nemesis, Phoenix Wright. Oh my god, dude, the roster is just so stacked in this game. Like, it is so good. Honestly, I doubt we'll ever have an MVC roster this good again. Like, I just don't see it happening. The graphics were also really nice for the time. The game actually uses 3D, not sprites, and it looked amazing. It looked like the comic books. It was great. The art style was great, the graphics were great, everything was flashy, and it was just a very solid fighting game that is still played nowadays because it is actually just a really solid fighting game. And I've always had a lot of fun with it. In the many years that I've come back to this game, I've never not had a good time with it. It's also the most accessible, as it is the most modern of all the MVCs, and if you're going to play any MVC, this might be the one you want to play. But it's not what I consider the best, and it's not my favorite MVC game. And my number one pick, you already know it, it's Marvel vs. Capcom 2, baby. It's one of the best fighting games ever made. It's arguably the best fighting game on the Dreamcast, and it is arguably the best crossover game in history. Absolutely the fan favorite of the series, and just kind of Capcom's fighting game library in general. It is still played very seriously today. And which game did Evo bring back a couple years ago? Was it MVC 1? Was it Ultimate MVC 3? No, it was Marvel vs. Capcom 2, baby. This is just one of the best fighting games ever made. 56 characters, yes, 56 characters, like the biggest for any Capcom fighting game, featuring all the fan favorites at the time. Nobody was left out from any of the previous Capcom fighting games. They're all here and they all kick ass. The game had pretty good balancing, all things considered. It had the craziest action. It had the craziest combos. Like, you can do some wild shit in this game that you can't even do in the other Marvel games. It brings back the variable assist for Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter. That's awesome. It is the best sprites of the series, easily. All the sprite work is amazing. The backgrounds are really cool. The music, the music, man, in this game. I want to take you for a ride. Need I say any more? The funky jazz music that's here as well. It's so good, man. And it's like, you know what? Capcom really was on a roll at this time, and this is their top game, in my opinion. This is like Capcom's best fighter. I've had so much fun over the years of this game. I've never not had a great time. Over 10 years of fun now. Like, this game just never gets old. There's so many combinations. There's so much depth. Like, it is just ludicrous. And it's great. Like, the game stands up incredibly well. It holds up all these years later very well. It's still very playable now. It's still pretty friendly, all things considered. Like, there's just never been a game that captured gamers' hearts in the same way that MVC2 did. MVC2 is truly the fan favorite. It truly is the MVC game that defines the series. It is the one that you think of when you talk about MVC, and there's a reason for that, because it's just all around a fantastic fighting game with so much to offer. And if you haven't played it, somehow in 2021, I really am like, how? I mean, if you don't like fighting games, of course you probably haven't played it. But if you truly like MVC, and you've at least made it to this part of the video, like, how have you not played it by now? Once it's safe with some friends, get the Dreamcast out, get the PS2 out, get the Xbox out, get the hacked PS3, whatever you got MVC2 on, you should get together, play MVC2, have a great time, love the game, love the characters, love just everything about this game. Unforgettable fighting experience, lots of great memories. That's it for this video. You already pretty much knew MVC2 was going to be the best one on this list. I mean, it's kind of obvious now, but anyway, what's your list? Let me know in the comments below. You have a good day, everyone.